On this very stage, a number of years ago, Preston Manning described Canada as the only country in the history of the world developed by the dramatic overexploitation of a rodent. Now, he meant by that beavers. Glynnis Hood has written this book, A Beaver Manifesto, and it reminded me of the fact that in the early years of this conference, I actually attempted a beaver manifesto of my own. I like the beaver as a symbol of Canada, and I was remarking on the fact that wherever you go in the world, if you're in a souvenir shop or looking at kids' toys, you'll see lots of teddy bears. But nowhere is a beaver in sight. Occasionally you'll see a little moose, but not many beavers. And so I was railing against that, and our chums at Roots had the beaver as one of their logos, and so in the first few years we would give away different kind of beavers, a different interpretation of the beaver every year, and this one year we took a shot of people with their beavers. Yes. And so I was proclaiming this manifesto of my own, and I wanted to close the beaver gap. But that came to nothing much. I had this brainchild. I wanted Roots to make an Einstein beaver, and I thought we would begin with a whole, you know, you can sort of see them, can't you? Einstein beavers and Trudeau beavers. And, well, another wig bubble that came to nothing. Anyways. Glynnis, please tell us about our national symbol, the sturdy, the earnest beaver.
Well, I have to admit that when I got this email inviting me to Idea City, I thought, number one, is this a serious email? Really? Because I sat down and I thought, but I study a rodent. And then I thought, well, it's not just any rodent. This is the second largest rodent in the world next to the capybara in South America. And really, it's one of the most spectacular animals we have on the planet. I'm a little biased, indeed, but it really is this amazing rodent that's been doing amazing things for a very, very long time. There has been some form of beaver-like rodent around for over 30 million years. And our beaver of today, Castor canadensis, the North American beaver, was right alongside what we know of as Castorides ohioensis, the giant beaver, which was the size of a black bear. It was about 3 meters long from snout to tail. I know you're all gasping. Don't worry, it was a vegetarian. But they were right side by side until about the end of the last Great Ice Age. Now, if you think about it, we don't see a whole lot of giant beavers around anymore. But we certainly see Castor canadensis, the North American beaver, and there's only one other relative existing on the planet, and that's Castor feber, the European beaver. But this animal survived when the saber-toothed cat didn't, the woolly mammoth didn't, and certainly the giant beaver didn't. And it survived through many, many different climatic changes, from ice ages to very warm periods, and now to today's current climate. So it's tenacious. It's an animal that sparks a lot of questions, and if it's able to survive all of these big shifts in climate, just how important is the beaver to our ecosystems? Well, in North America, beavers helped create the continent in many ways. In some of the legends, actually, some of the Ojibwe legends, they were the creators of the world. But in North America, a lot of our places evolved with beavers on the landscape from a very, very long time. And so when I was starting my PhD or working on my PhD over 10 years ago now, my former PhD advisor and I, Dr. Suzanne Bailey, asked the question, well, we know beavers like water, but just how much of an influence do beavers have on keeping water on the landscape itself? And that was the start of our research. Well, to understand this, you have to go back ecologically a little ways into Canada's history. Now, I actually have a copy of this map on my wall. You don't see the map itself, but this is the inset on it. And it was made by Herman Maal, who originally was from the Netherlands. in 1715, and I love the name of it, The New and Exact Map of the Dominions of the King of Great Britain on Ye Continent of North America. Now, you see, I teach a course called Geographic Information Systems. I'm teaching environmental science at the University of Alberta, Augustana campus. And I tell my students, when you make a map, it's about advertising. It's not about the destination. It's about, well, it's more about the destination than the actual journey. It's about what you want to sell. Maps are selling tools. And anyone who has ever used a map knows that you get lost in the right places, but you never really know where you're going. Well, when these maps were made, there was a whole series of maps called the Beaver Maps, and there's one that sold for $40,000 last year in the auction houses in New York. And there were a series of Beaver Maps. Malls is one of the more famous ones, and they're all based on this drawing by a Jesuit priest who was around the Niagara Falls area in the 1600s. And they were designed to sell North America to the royalty, to the people with money who wanted to invest in the next great thing. They weren't selling oil, they weren't selling gold, they weren't selling vast expanses of forests and wildlife. They were selling beaver because it was priceless. Beavers in Europe had already been wiped out, more or less. There's only about 1,200 beavers left in Europe and into Russia of the European beaver. And it was like falling on a gold mine. I love this drawing, though, because it's Niagara Falls, and you have all these zombie-like beavers walking along with rocks on their tails and sticks in hand, much like the Canadian hockey team at the last Vancouver Olympics, going for that gold medal. I had to say it because I'm originally from British Columbia, and I don't want to bring up the Canucks. But just an amazing thing, and you can see just this army of beavers walking through trying to tackle Niagara Falls. And lots of people have used video today, and I don't have any videos, so I thought, well, we've got to put some music to this. And I tend to call beavers into shore quite a bit. I live on almost an island that's completely surrounded by a beaver pond. And sometimes at night for a kick, when the satellite's not working, I'll go down to the pond and I'll call beavers in. So you can imagine if all these beavers walking around and the sound that they make. But there's more than one beaver out there, so I'm going to get you guys to help me with this. Yeah. Let's reenact 1715. So you close your mouth and you just breathe through your nose and you just go. And if you want, you can slap your tail. I just had to do this in this beautiful concert hall. I hear it's one of the most spectacular ones in North America. Well, the fur trade was well underway by this point, and it was a really successful fur trade. By the time, between 1769 and 1868, over 4.7 million beaver pelts sold in London in the auctions. That's just London. That doesn't also include all the beavers that were harvested at that time, and certainly there were trade of Canadian beavers all the way into Turkey. So we had almost mirrored what had happened in Europe by about the mid-1800s. We had almost wiped out the North American beaver. Where I live, I actually live in the Beaver Hills of East Central Alberta. I am just, yeah, I can't say much more than that. Try attending a conference about sex and doing a talk on beavers. I'll just stop it there. The flirty girls wouldn't leave me alone in the green room. So I imagine this, though, that we had almost wiped out the entire beaver population in North America in a very short period of time. So by the 1850s, where I live in the Beaver Hills, beavers were wiped out. By the 1600s, almost the entire East Coast was clean of beavers. There were no beavers left. By the turn of the century, by the 1900s, almost all the beaver populations were wiped out in North America, except for a few isolated pockets. We've done pretty well for ourselves. So as an ecologist, I think, well, what would the landscape look like without beavers on the landscape? And I have to argue that it would look very, very dry and not at all its ecological self. These animals are designed for water. All their sensory organs are well in line with the water, so they can keep them above the water all the time when they're swimming. Their back end is very much aquatic. Their front end with their two little claws is very much terrestrial. There are so many animals and plants that depend on beavers that it's so well documented. Right now we're working on some research looking at the influence of beaver ponds on amphibian populations. I've looked at waterfowl, and I'm also looking at aquatic macroinvertebrates. And beavers influence so many things, and they're so important to so many landscapes. So we were lucky enough in our study area, Dr. Bailey and I, to ask this question about what influence do beavers really have on keeping water on the landscape, and we found some really dramatic results. What we did was we were able to access over 54 years of aerial photograph coverage of our study area in Elk Island National Park, which is just about 45 minutes east of Edmonton, Alberta. We had climate data that went back to the 1800s. When we had all of this beaver occupancy data of where all the active lodges are, when they were active, when they were inactive, going back to 1941 when beavers were successfully reintroduced into Elk Island National Park. And we were able to combine them all and find some pretty spectacular results. We were able to find that beaver alone, the presence of active beaver lodges alone, accounted for over 83% of the extent of open water on the landscape, over and above the climatic variables. Well, that's pretty spectacular. But we were also able to find that these ponds, we'd look at ponds over time when they had beaver in them, when they didn't. And remember, we didn't have beaver in the study area within Elk Island for over 100 years. And we were able to look at these ponds as beavers came back, and ponds with beaver had 9 times more open water in them. The extent of water was 9 times greater in ponds with beaver than those same ponds without beaver. Beaver were actually driving the amount of water on the landscape. Well, one of the most spectacular things that we found was that we were really fortunate as aquatic ecologists to have the worst drought on record happen right in the middle of our field season. Most people were panicking. All the amphibian people were just going, what are we going to do? I thought, this is fantastic. We get to see what this animal really does when the pressure's on. And so 2002 was the worst drought on record. And within our study period from 1948 to 2002, we had one other drought, 1950. 4th driest year on record, and the 2nd driest year in our study period. Even though 1950 was a very dry year, there was still 47% more precipitation than the worst drought on record in 2002. But beaver weren't in that part of our study area yet until the mid-1950s. What we found was that in 2002, even though things were really, really dramatic, we had over 61% more water area in our study area than in 1950. Beavers were mitigating the effects of even extreme drought. And this was shocking to us. It went against every hypothesis that we had come up with prior to going into this study. So when I think about what the landscape was like with beaver gone, it was really obvious to me at that point, is that we have really, really changed landscapes for well over 100 years when those beavers were gone, because at the same time we were removing many, many wetlands. We were filling them in for agriculture. We've lost over 70% of our non-boreal wetlands. In many of the areas south of the boreal forest in Alberta, it's over 70% of our wetlands are gone. And so with beaver coming back to the landscape, we get water back as well. And it seems like a really simple answer, but man, this was such a surprise to so many people. Well, what I'm looking at now isn't so much how much water do we have. I still look at that question a bit as well. But I also look at how are beaver doing this? They're just a rodent, right? That's what I thought at first. They're just a rodent. Well, if I were to fly you over my current study area, which again is still in the Beaver Hills, just south of Elk Island now, in a place called Miquelon Lake Provincial Park, a little jewel that nobody knows about, and you were to look down, you see these little dots, just right there, and right there, and right there, and right there, and there's a couple on the shore. Those are beaver lodges. Beavers live in lodges, they build dams. So you think, well, of course beaver hold water on the landscape because they build dams and they block rivers and streams and we get mad. My landscape consists of isolated little ponds, and it did in Elk Island as well. So I couldn't say, well, they're just damming up waterways and that's how they're keeping water on the landscape. Because my area has streams that are intermittent at best, and in the summertime they dry up. So how are beaver doing it? Well, we know that beavers dig channels. I've seen them dig channels right through the middle, across a road. Luckily, I stopped the vehicle. See this? They connect that pond with that pond, with that pond, with that pond. Oh, dead end. They go here, they go here, they go here, they go here, they go down over here, they go here. There's an old channel there. They're digging channels with those two front little paws. Just like farmers that drain their croplands in the spring, digging drainage ditches, beavers are doing the same thing. They're focusing water off the land into these channels. And in so doing, they're maintaining water, even in the driest years. What we found during this drought was that farmers were seeking out landowners who still had active beaver lodges on their properties in order to water the cattle and feed them. It was the only place you could find green grass. Beavers do another thing. They don't just dig channels between ponds, they dig them on the bottom of the ponds as well. We see this with ponds that have emptied out. And they also dig mounds and mounds of soil away from the entrance to their lodges so that they can establish their food caches. So they're making deeper ponds which are more resilient to evaporation. So beavers are just this amazing animal. So why then do we spend so much time and money fighting this animal and tackling it and removing it from the landscape over and over again? We've shown time and time again that it increases the biodiversity of an area. When we construct wetlands as humans, they can't hold a candle to the biodiversity within beaver-created wetlands. They just can't. It's night and day. You can tell it right away. We have a really strange relationship with beavers, and there are alternative methods to manage the beaver problem. I always call it the facility location problem, where people put roads in the wrong places. But there are flow devices that people like Skip Lyle in the United States have created, the Caster Master and the Beaver Deceiver. And certainly they allow the pond to stay the same level. They allow the beaver to stay in the habitat, maintaining that biodiversity, and they protect the infrastructure as well. So there are methods out there that we can use for this. But there's this conflict. It's funny. We think back to the Vancouver Olympics again. There was a giant beaver mascot floating over the closing ceremonies on a tether. And it's like we covet this animal. You try studying beavers for your PhD in Canada. I have an entire closet full of slippers and beaver shirts and teddy bears and everything else. We covet it, but we loathe it at the same time. It's just bizarre. So I think it ties in a little bit to how we view natural resources as a whole. If they're well behaved and they're on a tether, we're quite content with them. But the minute we see their wild side, remember the sticks? The minute we see that, we start to get a little bit nervous, and we start to try to control them again. I think the beaver reminds us that despite all odds, it can handle it. It's tenacious. We wiped out the herds of bison. We cleared the sky of passenger pigeons. We've cleared many, many forests for agriculture, but we haven't been able to get rid of the beaver, despite all of our efforts. And so maybe it represents our ecological second chance. And with beaver, maybe it tells us that rather than view our natural resources as gross domestic products, we have to look at them more as gross environmental products and reap the benefits for years to come. So with that said, it's time to call back the beaver, and I'd like to thank you very much for your attention. They're making the sound. They're calling like a beaver.
Glynnis, I've just received an email from a pal of mine who's been watching online, and he wants to know how he can invest in the Beaver Deceiver.
Invest in the Beaver Deceiver. There's a couple of companies. Skip Lyle has one, and he's out of the United States, and he has a patent on the Caster Master and the Beaver Deceiver, and also there's a company called Beaver Solutions. I know.
It's tough. Sympathy.
Anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you, Glynnis. That's great.
Okay.